Hi, I'm Ruben Marshak. Welcome to Armchair Philosophy. On this episode, I'll be addressing the question, is it okay to punch a Nazi? This week in North Carolina, violence broke out during a protest when various right-wing organizations, some of which were neo-Nazi groups, collided with various left-wing organizations, including Antifa and Black Lives Matter. One person was killed in a terrorist attack with a vehicle which was driven by someone who was sympathetic with the right-wing cause. Others on both sides were victims of physical assault, in some cases with weapons such as rocks or pepper spray. This has sparked a lot of discussion about group identities and violence. Is it ever okay to attack someone based solely on their political affiliation? What if the party they choose to follow has historically been responsible for genocide, or if their ideas are simply racist? In the tradition of philosophy, the group making the positive claim has to deal with the burden of proof. Statements such as, "it is the case that X," are what count as positive statements. In this case, the group making the claim that it's okay to punch a Nazi, or that it's morally acceptable to assault someone based off of their political ideology, has to face the burden of proof. With that in mind, I've analyzed some of the common arguments in favor of that position. Let's see how they stand up to criticism. 1. Americans have always fought the Nazis. This argument usually takes one of two forms. The first is that it's an American tradition, or part of American ideals, to fight against Nazism. And the other is more personal, including details about family members fighting against the Nazis during World War II. And sharing some kind of concept of inherited duty. Any student of logic should be able to point out the flaw in the first argument's form. It's a classical example of an argumentum ad antiquatum, or appeal to tradition fallacy. In this case, the conclusion that it's okay to punch Nazis is supposed to be true based solely on the fact that it's always been done this way. Arguments like this have a couple of major problems. First, that the tradition itself may be baseless, or based outside of the truth, which likely isn't the case. There's a plethora of information about Americans and their involvement during World War II, and we know the reasons why Americans were involved in the European front during that time. However, it's not a documented historical fact that our involvement was based solely on an objection to the philosophical ideals of the Nazi Party. In fact, various Nazi-like and straight-up Nazi parties have existed in the United States of America and have ebbed and flowed in popularity over time. A moral objection to the Nazi Party may have very well played a major part in our decision to be involved, but it would be foolish to say that it was the only deciding factor. That brings me to the second issue with the appeal to tradition. Circumstances change. The Nazi Party is no longer a major player in American or European politics. They don't claim ownership of any state, and they don't pose any military threat any more than a small state militia, which is to say any group of armed citizens. When Germany invaded Poland, a violent response may have been justified, or even obvious. But no Nazi nation is invading any other nation today, and the same response may not be justified in this instance. The second form of the argument deals more with family legacy and inherited duty. But with respects to filial piety, this kind of obligation isn't seen in any other part of our society. For example, imagine you've got a bright young girl named Sally. Sally's entire lineage of female ancestors were housewives. Her mother, grandmother, and every other female who's ever been part of her family were all housewives. But Sally has shown a lot of skill in the sciences and would make a great physicist. Following the rules of inherited duty, Sally would be required to spend her life taking care of children and cleaning a house instead of pursuing science. That would deny her personal autonomy. It would essentially make her a slave, unable to make her own decisions or live her own life. But even if it were the case that such inherited duty exists, wouldn't all Germans then have the same inherited duty to continue the genocide that their ancestors started? The concept of inherited duty does nothing but to enslave people and impede progress, and anyone accepting this stance must also accept those things. 2. Those ideas are dangerous and have no place in modern society. Some say that certain ideas are inherently dangerous. Racism, the support of group supremacy, or any kind of nationalist, violent, or non-egalitarian views are usually included in this category. A more accurate statement may be that those values don't mix very well with those things that we value in our current society. The vast majority of the population of the United States would likely be disgusted by the concept of racial segregation, let alone cultural genocide. And those things, when put into effect, are extremely harmful and bear the responsibility of a lot of death, destruction, and suffering throughout the centuries. The key phrase being, when put into effect. For decades, cartoonists have been creating scenes of extreme violence. Authors have been creating doomsday plans which, if put into effect, would kill a lot of people. But it's very rare for someone watching TV seeing someone get shot on screen to actually care about it as if the events weren't fictional. In fact, we may see that as some kind of mental illness. Still, all of those ideas are violent. At times, explicitly so. If an idea isn't put into practice, it can't harm anyone. The presence of certain ideas can increase the likelihood that they will be put into practice. But at times those ideas are present and aren't even expressed to anyone. Returning to the example of Sally, imagine now that she has a cousin named Ted. Ted is an extremely bigoted man. He hates everyone who isn't just like him. But Ted never shows it. He lives in society and engages with everyone as equals, and he doesn't let his views affect his actions. Most people don't even know that Ted is a bigot. It would be ridiculous to say that he's caused any harm. But if he spreads his ideas, others may cause harm because of them. So we're left with two issues instead of the original. That ideas can lead to immoral actions, and that the spreading of those ideas can facilitate that process. The ideas themselves aren't dangerous. The actions are, and the things that contribute to those actions are. A Nazi who commits no immoral actions hasn't actually harmed anyone. But even these aren't safe points to stand on if you're trying to argue that it's okay to punch a Nazi. The spreading of information is how we learn about different groups and their ideals. And to prevent the spread of Nazism would require in turn to censor literally everything that had to do with World War II until today. Without access to that kind of information, the mistakes of the past can easily be brought back into practice today. Limiting exposure to dangerous ideas inherently also means censoring most of the entertainment out there today, which is pragmatically impossible because nobody wants to deal with hordes of angry Game of Thrones fans. The other point, that ideas can lead to immoral actions, is true. Potential for the actualization of those ideas exists, though only as potential, not as a necessity. The idea then becomes, does my punching a Nazi actually decrease the likelihood that Nazism will spread? The clear answer is no. Every act of violence against one of these people, especially if they weren't physically attacking you, just creates more sympathizers for their movement. In addition, more violence against them also means more media exposure, which in turn makes the Nazi and white supremacist groups more active and will get them more members. There really isn't a way to deal with it other than killing all of the Nazis at once. But if you did that, then you'd be guilty of genocide. So there isn't an ethical way to remove them from society. All Nazis must die! Which brings me to the final common argument that a world without Nazism is just a better place. And so any act of exterminating them, punching them, destroying them, etc. is itself a good thing. In other words, that the ends justify the means. The view that certain necessary evils must be done in order to accomplish the greater good has likely been around since people first started asking ethical questions, but it's most famously associated with Machiavelli. Niccolò Machiavelli was an Italian philosopher who was probably most famous for writing The Prince, which some view as brutal because of some such lines as, I quote, "If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared." Machiavelli provides a lot of advice which may or may not be genuinely useful, but many philosophers consider his works to be abhorrent. Consequentialists, however, might consider his works to be of very much use, and might also consider punching Nazis to be a good thing. Consequentialism takes the stance that the consequences of actions are what morally arbitrate whether those actions were good or bad. An example of this would be Ozymandias from the Watchmen comics, who was willing to sacrifice the lives of millions of innocent people for the goal of saving billions of innocent people, in his view. But there are some problems with consequentialism that just can't be avoided. It has the potential to justify nearly any action, if not every action, so it has the large potential for abuse. Possible unintended consequences of actions can lead to even greater problems, and there are some actions which are generally inconsequential, which we still consider to be unethical, such as grave robbing. Let's return to the original question. Is it okay to punch a Nazi? There are many reasonable points of view which would say that it is perfectly okay, namely Machiavellians and consequentialists. Moral skeptics and nihilists would probably admit it, though they wouldn't necessarily say that it's a good thing. But if you aren't willing to accept the consequences of those philosophical systems, then punching a Nazi when they aren't attacking you generally isn't considered a good thing by most philosophers. It's pretty hard to defend, which is made apparent by the lack of arguments which support it. Most of them are appeals to emotion that don't really engage with logical reasoning at all. What arguments do exist in favor of it come with a lot of baggage which you might not want to accept. Ultimately, ethics aren't set in stone, and there are no clear, true answers. But in my view, it isn't advisable to punch a Nazi unless they're attacking you directly, or threatening to attack you or someone you care about. If you want to stand up against those beliefs, you should protest against them peacefully. And in your writing and your dealing with others, you should stand against those beliefs rationally. Following that kind of model, instead of just punching people you disagree with, will overall lead to a much more peaceful world. That's it for this time on Armchair Philosophy. I'm Ruben Marshak. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you later.